Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Tales and Mysteries of the Mojave Patrol. I got another couple of strange stories for you tonight. One is, well, they're both true. There's no denying that, because they both happened. One is, something that happened in the 1960s. And one that is something that happened to me in the 1970s and had an impact in my life in the 2000s. But before we get started, I'm going to pour myself a shot of Shackleton's. This is a reproduction, from what I understand, an exact reproduction of the whiskey that Shackleton took with him on his expedition to the South Pole. When archaeologists, and I guess there's no better word than archaeologists for who these people are, went to the South Pole to excavate Shackleton's camp. I think they found 11 bottles of whiskey that were frozen in his base camp, and they transported it back to the UK, to Scotland as a matter of fact, and over the period of a year they very slowly thawed it out. They brought the temperature up a little bit every week. They didn't want to damage the whiskey or the bottles or the cases. They wanted everything to be perfect. And then once they were liquefied, they brought in an expert to sample the whiskey. And this guy is, let's put it this way, when I saw this special on television about it, it changed how I viewed blended whiskey forever. He took months and months and months of smelling the whiskey to ascertain what the ingredients were before he even tasted it. And then it was another several months, him jotting notes, sipping the whiskey, not actually even drinking it, sipping it, spitting it out, cleansing his mouth, writing notes, until they figured they had the exact recipe, because the company that made the whiskey had long since closed. And when it was blended, he said it tasted exactly the same. It was exactly the same whiskey that Shackleton took with him to the South Pole. And guys, it's called Shackleton. And if it was good enough for Shackleton, it's good enough for you. I got this, fortunately, I got that at Smart and Final. It's available at various other venues, and I paid $35 for that bottle, and I've seen it for more. I haven't seen it for less. I think I got the best deal. Well, the first story is about the USS Thresher, and before I start that story, here's to the men of the Thresher. May they rest in peace. Heroes all. That's good stuff. In April of 1963, the USS Thresher was undergoing sea trials after a refit. And it was going through various tests, torpedo tests, dive tests, surfacing tests, pretty comprehensive tests for a submarine that had just been had a refit. Pretty standard from what I understand. And then something catastrophic happened. They lost communication with it, and after a while they determined it was lost. One of the submarines in contact with the Thresher was the Sea Owl, and the last they heard from the Thresher was that they were down by the stern at an upward angle and they were blowing, attempting to surface. And a short time later, they heard what they thought was an explosion, and they assumed this was the Thresher imploding. And it sank in 8,500 feet, I think, of water. But under the Freedom of Information Act, just recently, there was a report issued by the USS Seawolf, which was one of the rescue ships. According to the Seawolf, they were in electronic and voice communication with the Thresher. Well, let's put it this way. For between 30 and 40 hours after it was presumed lost. They were monitoring the transmissions from the forward and aft emergency locator beacons. They said that they heard underwater radio, underwater telephone messages from the Thresher. They heard banging on the hull. Now, a lot of people are saying that this information is misconstrued by the Seawolf, that they were hearing noises from the surrounding rescue vessels. But on a couple of occasions, the Seawolf had communicated with another vessel, and this vessel had warned off all the other rescue vessels from the area so that the Seawolf could operate in silence and listen. So the most telling piece of information of this whole ordeal was that the Seawolf had directed the Thresher to ping its mainframe sonar. And over a period of hours, they managed to get 37 pings. Now, if this thing's a pile of rubble on the bottom of the ocean, you're not going to get 37 pings from the mainframe on request. That's just not going to happen. So apparently some catastrophic event overtook the Thresher. And over a period of almost 2 days, from the 10th to the 12th, April 12th being the anniversary of the Titanic sinking, in an area not too far from where the Thresher sank, they were slowly descending from test depth to crush depth. Probably trying everything they could to get back up. As a matter of fact, the Sea Owl said that in one of the telephone messages they received from the Thresher, they could hear the ballast blowing. And it was quite loud in the telephone set. What happened to the Thresher can only be conjecture. The Thresher had contacted the Sea Owl and said they had a minor problem, a minor leak, and they were dealing with it, and they would surface soon. But obviously that minor problem turned into a major problem. Now, before everybody gets their knickers in a knot, there was absolutely nothing anybody could do to rescue these men. Nothing. This is at a time when rescue options were limited. Very limited. And by the time you get down to crush depth, you're so far down that there's no escaping that submarine. I'm sure at test depth you can't escape, at least, and survive. But anyway, apparently the Thresher did not sink right away. It lingered for as long as maybe 36 to 40 hours between test depth and crush depth. Most of the time in communication with the Sea Wolf, and part of the time in communication with the Sea Owl. It was a 200-page report. If you want to get to the gist of the report, and if it's generating a lot of heat and steam and smoke in that rear torpedo room, I can see how there could be a failure, some kind of big issue that could have caused flooding and the loss of the submarine eventually. But that's just my theory. You know, I'm not a naval architect or, you know, a naval engineer. But I have heard of that happening. As a matter of fact, they think a Russian submarine had the same problem in the forward torpedo room. But that's just conjecture. And now with my second story, which was all coincidence. Basically all coincidence. So, right after high school, I pretty much joined the Army. Well, much to my surprise, I found out when you join the Army, you don't go right away. You don't go right away. I said, when do we leave? You know, I went down to AFES and I took the physical and all that fun, all that happy horse crap. A lot of you Vietnam-era guys like me, you know exactly what I mean if you're from this area, right? I said, oh no, you're not going for a couple, 3 months. You have to wait till a training cycle opens up for you. Like, what? So now, I'm stuck with the unenviable position of trying to find employment. Well, actually, it wasn't that hard. I went to work for a company called Industrial Security Patrol. And I was basically a security guard. I had to take a test, get my guard card because they were armed posts, and I worked I was an armed guard in a bank, and you know, various other locations, you know, construction areas and that type of thing. You know, I didn't have like a permanent post. You know, you floated around. You did a lot of different places. Well, one of the places I worked for a couple of weeks was Rio Hondo College. And I was a parking officer, parking control. And there were three of us there. And we had this little, we would direct traffic when school was starting or school was ending, or, for the day. And during the middle of the day, you would cruise around on this little electric scooter, which we take turns doing, we rotated it, and write tickets. College tickets, but still technically, if you found a student vehicle parked in a location they weren't supposed to be parked in, you wrote a ticket, stuck it under the windshield wiper, and at the end of the day you turned in your blanks, or not your blanks, but your carbons, carbon paper, remember that? And that's how that worked, Well, to make that story short, I worked with an older gentleman, and he was close to my age in 1973. And there was this break room that we took breaks in, and when you weren't sitting in, when you weren't driving the little scooter around, you were more than welcome to just sit in the break room and wait for your turn, right? It wasn't a high-pressure work. It was pretty laid back. Well, the TV was on in the break room, and we were watching TV, and around the middle of the day, the news came on, It was probably out at OKHJ News. And they had an article, or a news blurb, about the Japanese ambassador was going to come to Los Angeles to dedicate something at the Asian Pacific Museum. Well, this older gentleman, started flipping out. I said, dude, what's your problem? And he says, oh, those blankety-blank blanks, he used the J word, those blankety-blank Japs, they need to go back to Japan and stay there. I don't know why they're coming over this country after all they did during World War II. And he just went on and on and on and on and on. And okay, fine, right? So we were just about wrapping up the day. We had we were on our last break. And he was all grumpy. I said, hey man, what's this thing about you and the Japanese people? So he kind of looked at me, and we were just by ourselves in the break room. And he goes into this story. You see, he was a Marine during the Second World War. And he was in the Battle of Okinawa. And if there's anybody out there who doesn't know what the Battle of Okinawa was, you need to check into it, because it was a rough battle for the United States Marines, and that battle cost the lives of thousands of Americans. I think 7,000 over just a period of a few months. I think it works out that the Americans were losing almost 200 men a day to Japanese action. There were several hundred ships damaged by kamikazes. The Battle of Okinawa was the actual introduction of the kamikaze. In case you don't know what that is, that's where you intentionally fly your airplane into a ship in an attempt to destroy it. But I'm not going to get into the particulars about that. You can look it up. And the United States lost like 700 aircraft. I mean, it was a BFD. A lot of people were killed. And this guy was well and truly embittered by his experiences in Okinawa during the Second World War. And in those days, PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, disorder, whatever they want to call it now, there was nothing, nobody did anything for it. And a lot of these old-timers didn't go to a counselor at the VA because they didn't want anybody to think they were weaklings. So they just swallowed it and they dealt with it. And they got on with their lives, In case there's a lot of young people wonder why the people from the 40s, 50s, and 60s had sticks up their ass. You have to remember that a lot of these guys fought in World War II. They fought in Europe, and they fought in the Pacific, and they had seen firsthand what unregulated or unbridled socialism did to the world, and they weren't going to have any of it. They weren't going to have it. You know. But anyway, that's off the topic. The topic is this guy. I'm going to call him Jim. Anyway, Jim told us story. He was on a. This is what did it. This is what messed him up. He was out on patrol. It was he and a squad of Marines, and probably between 7 to 10 guys, and they were out traipsing through Okinawa, trying to. He said that they were supposed to make contact with the enemy. They were supposed to probe to see where the enemy's line of defense was, and then report back. So he said, part of the patrol, they had to take this trail up this canyon, and up the side of the canyon was a narrow trail to a little saddle at the top, and you would go over onto a plateau, and they were to go from there. But as they're halfway up the trail, all these Okinawans come over the civilians. They come over up through the saddle, and they start coming down, and they got their hands up, and they're talking a mile a minute, and unfortunately, no one in this guy's patrol could speak English, or speak. They all spoke English. They couldn't speak. Well, some of them probably spoke Brooklyn, but nobody spoke Japanese. They didn't know what they're saying. So they're trying to gesture for the people to come down, and at the bottom of the canyon, they were going to corral everybody and send them back with a couple of guys to watch them, right? Well, in the middle of the group, there was this woman, and he said she was a young woman, right? Not even in her 20s. And she's crying her eyeballs out, right? She's just crying and crying and crying. And she's holding a baby. And the baby's crying. And the mom's crying and the baby's crying. And she keeps trying to hand the baby off to these Marines, right? And this guy, Jim, he thought something was up with that. Because she's trying to hand her baby to all these different Marines. But no, we can't take the baby. You take the baby back with you and the baby will be fine. So finally, out of desperation, she throws the baby. And she threw it to this guy, Jim. You talk about totally caught by surprise. He looks up and his baby's sailing towards him. So he tries to catch the baby. Now he's holding his M1 Garand, right? He's doing all this. He puts the M1 Garand and he tries to catch the baby. When he grabs the baby comes out of its little blanket and hits the deck screaming. And he bends over and he snatches up the baby. He's trying to wrap it back up in a blanket. When he turns around, the woman, her kimono had fallen open. And she's got dynamite strapped to her. And the fuse is burning. So he yells for everybody to hit the deck. Because he sees this bomb in this woman. And he grabs the baby and he hits the deck and boom, she explodes. And the second she blows up, Japanese soldiers boil up over that saddle like ants coming out of a kicked over ant's nest. That's what he said. And there was this horrific firefight, he said, which lasted 20 minutes between them and the Japanese soldiers. And finally, when it's all resolved, a lot of the Okinawans are dead because the Japanese were just shooting indiscriminately at whoever was down there. All the Japanese soldiers almost were killed. Some were severely wounded. And a couple of Marines, I think, were killed. And he told me at that point he stopped caring. He stopped caring about anything. He says if they wanted to die, he was going to help them on their way. It didn't matter who they were. He would shoot anyone he saw, any one of them he saw. Now this sounds like a terrible, mean-spirited thing, but you weren't there. You didn't experience the horrors and the tragedies that these men went through. And you have to look at it that way. You cannot look at events from the past through modern eyes. That does not work. You have to put yourself in the position of the men who fought these battles. I'm probably going to get a lot of heat for this, but this is what he told me. Well, I told him I was sorry that happened to him, that he needed to try to relax, because he was really virtually crying telling this story. And you know what? He needed to tell that story to somebody, and I happened to be convenient. I feel like I'm a compassionate guy. I've had to listen to other veterans who have had these type of experiences. Friends of mine. Well, I worked with a guy at Disney who was at Hamburger Hill. That battle. And he'd cry a lot when he started talking about it. I really felt bad for the guy. Took an AK-47 round to the face. Blew out his right eye and ear. If you don't think that affects you. Anyway, here's the coincidental part of the story. A few years back, Showtime did a special called The Pacific, and they just recently reran it. It was a 10-part series, mini-series, very similar to Band of Brothers, but it dealt with the Marines in the Pacific during World War II. And it was more about the horrors they faced than the actual battles they fought, though they showed some battle scenes. As a matter of fact, there's a scene in the film where one of the episodes where they're crossing this airfield at Peleliu. The Japanese had fortified the terminal building, and the Marines had to take it. And the Japanese did not want to give up that building. And they had to cross that concrete airfield to get it. And that was a hell of a battle. And when I was working at Disney, I ran into an old-timer who had to cross that airfield. But anyway, so we're watching this one of the episodes of the Pacific. Now, I had told this story about Jim to my family on several times. Anyway, we were sitting on the couch and we're watching the Pacific. And my youngest daughter was there, and my wife and I. And lo and behold, we're watching the scene where these Marines are on patrol, and they go up this canyon, and over the top of the hill come these Okinawans, and there's the lady with the baby. And she throws the baby. And this Marine gets the baby, and then she explodes. They see she's got the bomb, and she explodes. And the Japanese soldiers come over the hill. And I got goosebumps. I got goosebumps. And it got really cold in the room, it felt like to me. And I look around, and there's my wife and my daughter staring at me. My oldest daughter goes, "Holy cow, Dad. That guy you talked to at work had to be one of those Marines." I said, "Yeah. Imagine that." I mean, 30 some odd years before, one of the guys in that squad told me the very story I was watching on the television. I get goosebumps thinking about it just now. You know? Kind of crazy. Every so often I think about that guy. Think about what he probably went through, the effect it had on him, and maybe his his wife and his family, his kids growing up. Well, my father-in-law fought in the Second World War, and it affected him, and it affected his family. In minor ways, but it did. Someday I'll tell you that story about him. It's not like the beer and ice story. I'll tell that story. Because my father-in-law did a lot of stuff during the war. Stuff that was famous. You know, I've interviewed, well, I know it's over 200. I'm not going to say interviewed. Well, I guess in a way I did interview him. I talked to, it was my father-in-law who got me started in a real interest in World War II, and I make it I make a point of trying to get information out of every World War II veteran I meet, or if I meet the family of a World War II veteran, I try to get information for them, you know, so they know what their father or whatever had done, because sometimes, you know, that they don't talk about it, or have never talked about it, you know. That Marine I met at Disney one day when we were parking in when Toy Story was open, and we were parking cars in Toy Story, and there was this big long line of people waiting to get on the bus to go to Disneyland, and here was this tall gentleman, and he had 2 canes. He was there with his family. In my particular job that day, part of my job was really tough. I was handing out flyers. Whew. Wow, that was rough that day. The old joke is, if you're working at Disney, you're doing it wrong. Anyway, I'm walking down the line handing out flyers. Hey, do you want a flyer? You know, and people were taking them. And I look up ahead, and here's this real tall elderly gentleman. He's got 2 canes. He's standing there. It was like July or August. It was hot out, but, right? And he had a red ball cap on with one of those gold piping around here, and he had the 1st Marine Division emblem right here on the top of his hat, and embroidered around the edge of the hat. There was Iwo Jima, I think there was like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Peleliu, and Okinawa, just embroidered on the hat, right? And I looked up and I stopped and I said, "Excuse me, sir, let's get you out of this hot sun and get you on the bus." So I took him and his family. It was him and his wife and his son and it was he and his wife, his son and his wife and his granddaughter. And I got them all over, took them over to where the disabled van, because they didn't know they could take it. And I took him over there, I walked him over there, and we got him right away on the disabled, on the bus that took disabled people, right? And while we're waiting for the bus to show up, I stuck out my hand and I said, "Hey, I was in the 4th Infantry Division, 1973-76. It's an honor to shake your hand, sir." And he said, "Oh, it's an honor to shake yours." And we were talking. And then I saw, you know, when I was looking at his hat, and I said, "So you were at Peleliu, were you, sir?" And he just kind of gave me a look. And I said, "Well, I'm just wondering, did you have to cross that airfield to get to the main building?" He kind of cocked his head at me and he says, "Oh, you heard about that, didn't you?" I said, "Yes, sir, I did." Well, yeah, I was one of those Marines. They didn't want to give up that building. So I know that, sir. I understand that. That's all I wondered, if you had crossed that runway. Well, right then, his daughter chimes in, or his granddaughter, and says, "Hey, Grandpa, isn't this one of those guys? Isn't he one of those guys you call Army pukes?" Well, he turned and looked at her and said, just like this, "He can call me a jarhead, and I can call him a puke, and I don't ever want to hear you say either of those things. You got me?" It's like, "Oh, yes, Grandpa." "Well, good, as long as we understand." And he turns to me, "What were we talking about? That airfield?" And the bus came and I got him on. A guy came to the park, and he was the radio operator on duty in the Philippines, and he took the actual surrender message from the Japanese. He was the guy on duty who got the message and wrote it down and sent it off. Okay, I was talking to him and his son. They were writing a book about it, but I don't know whatever became of the book. I talked to two guest World War II veterans, and both of them were on the Bataan Death March. Guys in Battle of the Bulge, guys at D-Day, guys who flew B-24s and B-17s, fighter pilots. Crazy stories. Anyway, I guess tonight wasn't so mysterious, and it wasn't a lot about the Mojave Desert. But I just felt that I should tell you guys about what I heard. Tell you what, next week we'll talk about the spook lights. Oh, and you need to jump over and find some YouTubers called Pin in the Atlas and subscribe. They're great people. Pin in the Atlas. They explore all through the Mojave Desert, go into ghost towns and abandoned mines. Really nice people. Another person you should subscribe to is Wonder Hussy. The Pin in the Atlas folks are friends of Wonder Hussy. And she travels all over doing all these crazy vlogs, and she's kind of humorous and kind of fun, and I think she's a great person. So, anyway, thanks for joining me tonight on Tales and Mysteries of the Mojave Patrol. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to click like, and if you're seeing this for the first time, subscribe. Click the little bell to get all the notifications. And not much else I can say, except ciao for now.
Dumont, the world's largest organization devoted exclusively to television and electronics. Television receivers, television network, television picture tubes, telecasting equipment, electronic equipment, research. Dumont, first with the finest in television.